How to make the AI think with you and not for you. This is a big issue these days. The critics of the AI say that either it will get us rid of all the jobs or make us dumb. But I think it's all about how you use it. And in this video, I'm going to show you how you can use the AI to boost your intelligence. The core is to generate questions and not just the answers. In this case, you yourself have to do the thinking, and AI is simply guiding you along this path like a GPS. Let me show you how this works. But first, a little bit about myself. I'm Dimitri. I'm the developer of InfraNodus, the text analysis and visualization tool that you see right now on your screen. And I've been working on it for the last 10 years. It has a lot of AI features inside for analysis, but I always liked using the graph to analyze information and to find the gaps inside to generate some ideas from it. So this is why I'm really fascinated about using AI to augment our thinking rather than replace it. I like to share my ideas on this YouTube channel, so if you find it interesting, please subscribe so that this video can get recommended to other people interested in the same topic. So let's get back to it. I will show you a few approaches that I use and also how InfraNodus, the tool that I developed, can be useful for generating questions rather than answers and therefore making AI think with you and not for you. First, let's suppose we are having a conversation with ChatGPT. We can see it right now on the screen. Let's say I'm interested in the topic of combat strategies. So I'm asking ChatGPT, what are the different combat strategies? And it provides me a long answer. And of course, it's like a great way to learn about this, but in fact, it's quite difficult because I have to read through all those verbose answers, and it's not guaranteed I'm going to remember anything or I'm going to retain any information. As we know, the best learning comes with asking the right questions. So this is why I created the extension that you can use with any web page or for ChatGPT, InfraNodus extension, that I'm launching right now from the toolbar in my browser. And by default, this extension identifies the gap in your discourse, so the two topics that could be better connected, and then it uses AI to generate an interesting question that would link those topics in an interesting way, in a way that the system itself, in this case, the AI itself, ChatGPT itself, hasn't done yet. So here it's identifying two topics, morale shaping and combat variability, very interesting topics. If I click here, I can see statements that relate to them. And then it generates a question. How does the use of propaganda to shape enemy perception and morale integrate with flexible combat strategies that leverage individual retreats and traditional defensive maneuvers to effectively weaken and draw adversaries into disadvantageous positions? So here it's very interesting because it's asking me to think about the different military strategies, but in relation to propaganda, to informational warfare. And that's a super interesting topic. And in fact, that can help me start thinking in the direction that will be both interesting, relevant, but also original because it's connecting the topics in an interesting way. And if I like, I can think of this question myself. So for example, maybe I'm thinking about fake news or some sort of disinformation programs and how maybe putting out some piece of information that is not verified is a way to provoke the other party to respond so that one can then come out with a sort of negation of the original statement and so on, right? And that would be like an example of informational warfare. So I'm already starting to think about this subject. I can also take that very statement and paste it back into ChatGPT and ask it to answer that question for me. So I'm kind of using this human-in-the-loop approach to then have the AI generate not just something generic like it did here, but to start answering specific questions that relate to this discourse. So this is why I really like this approach, because it encourages me myself to think if I want, or I can also use it to generate better questions for AI and help it sort of get into the topic with me a little bit deeper, right? So I first answer the question myself, like I did before, and then I'm reading what it has to say, and I can compare it, for instance, and see if I missed anything interesting. For instance, here it's saying that you can create misinformation through propaganda. So I mentioned that. Flexible retreats to exploit enemy overconfidence. So that's interesting because it's basically, it's talking about how you can draw the enemy out, like you pretend that you are leaving the battlefield, the informational battlefield, but then you come back. So this I haven't thought of, and maybe that's an interesting topic to explore. Defensive maneuvers to support psychological warfare. So that's talking more about the actual warfare. Breaking the enemy's willpower in organizations. So that could be interesting. This idea of post-truth, nobody can believe in anything anymore. I think it relates more to that, and that's quite an interesting topic that it highlighted, and I can start thinking in this direction. Maintaining adaptability to capitalize on shifts in enemy morale. So that's also interesting because I can sort of predict what's going to happen and then have a strategy to implement in accordance to the outcome. So that would be an example of how you would use it with ChatGPT. You kind of put out an idea, like I did here, the original prompt. What are the different combat strategies? It provides me the answer. Then I launch the InfraNodus extension. It identifies the gap, generates the question for me, and then I try to answer that question myself, or I send it back to ChatGPT and have it generate the answer for me. If I want, by the way, I can also send it inside the chat of the InfraNodus extension itself, and then it's going to provide me a more concise answer to this question, which is also quite interesting. So, for example, here it says that integrating adaptive psychological warfare with flexible strategies redefines defense by creating cycles of evasion, leveraging propaganda to mislead and weaken enemy morale. This draws adversaries out, exploiting their vulnerabilities for effective counterattack. So that can be interesting if you like shorter responses as well. And here it provides you the references to where it actually took those responses from. And if you like to see how it works, you can also click on that button here that visualizes the actual three-dimensional representation of this text that you see right now on your screen. And the gaps are available here. So it shows you that, in fact, here are the topics that it identifies. So for example, strategic flexibility, adaptive evasion, strategic flexibility, morale, manipulation. And then once you find the gap that you find interesting, or where you actually visually can see that the clusters are on the opposite sides of the graph, because the way that the graph is created is that it's actually representing this whole text that you see here as a network. The words are the nodes, co-occurrences are the connections, and if the words tend to appear in the same context, they will be in the same topic. So then if the topics are on the opposite sides of the graph, it means they're not so well connected. And this is how you can identify interesting gaps here. So in that case, for instance, it's counter movement, strategic flexibility. And then I can either think of them myself. I can also click here to see what other keywords inside, so I get a better understanding of the topics. I can click on the context and see what are the actual statements that relate to them. So here I see that one is on propaganda, strategy, flexible combat. Another one, attack position, create. So maybe something about like creating some advantages through misinformation, and then propaganda strategies. And if I find it too difficult to start thinking in this direction, because sometimes it's really hard to connect those topics as they're not connected yet, I can click on the question, and then AI will generate an interesting question for me that will be a little bit better formed for me to start thinking in this direction. So here it says, how can integrating flexible combat strategies with misinformation campaigns create vulnerabilities in adversaries by manipulating their decision-making and movement, and what traditional and innovative approaches can be leveraged to counter such tactics effectively? In fact, I find it's a very interesting question. I'm going to save it into this chat. I can also, by the way, export it into InfraNodus itself, and then it's going to save it to a specific graph, which I can then later use for further references. So all my interesting ideas from ChatGPT are going to be saved inside the main version of InfraNodus in this case, which can be pretty useful. I'll show you later how you can use it. So that's kind of like a demonstration for you of how this works, but using the graph. So if you like, you can just use the actual questions only here. That's the default version. If you like, you can have the graph if you feel a bit more comfortable using graph visualizations and knowledge graph representations. And in the settings here, you can adjust which panel is the default one. So if you choose the graph, it's going to be the graph. If you choose brainstorm, it's going to be the question that is generated for you. And as you saw here, I used it on ChatGPT. Now let me show you how you can use it in Google search results. It's a similar methodology. So I'm going to make a search on combat strategies like I did here. I'll actually do it again so you see how that works. So I do the search on combat strategies, And then I have the InfraNodus button here, and then InfraNodus again builds in the background, it builds a graph, which is available if you click this button. And then it identifies the main topics, and then it finds the topics between which there is the biggest gaps, right? So here it's combat strategy and human prevention, for instance. In fact, if you click here, you will see other topics. So combat strategy and human prevention, and then it regenerates the question. And then it generates a question based on this gap. How can strategic combat and Air Force principles be applied to enhance antimicrobial resistance prevention and control efforts in Canada? That's interesting. Focusing on human health and government-led traffic reduction initiatives. So the great thing with AI is that it's always forced to make the connection between the topics, even if they're not so connectable. And here it's proposing to think about how we can actually use combat strategies to prevent diseases and epidemics. So that's a really interesting question, I think, because good ideas are always at the junction between different fields. So that can be super interesting for us to explore as well. And I can again save the clip into my notes. Here it's going to be another graph, everything that I generated from Google. I think I had something already from 7 months ago on this account, so it's quite interesting because gradually when I save more and more ideas, I will also see connections between them using the graph here, so that's quite interesting as well. And then I can come back to it and explore it further. Now, I want to show you also how you can do that inside the main version of InfraNodus. So inside the main version of InfraNodus, you can actually import data from multiple different places. Like if you go here and you type in some keyword that you would like to start with, for instance, combat strategies, it's going to offer you several options. You can search the web, get on the social media. So for instance, if you wanted to analyze all the tweets on a certain topic, you could do that here, or YouTube videos on that topic and so on. You can also generate data with AI, but I like to start with searching the web and specifically Google Scholar because it's quite scientific and it's very interesting the results that you get there. So then you click visualize, and what's going to happen is that InfraNodus will perform the search on combat strategies on Google Scholar and extract top 40 search results. You can make it bigger, the amount of search results, and then the results are already selected by Google. So the titles and the snippets of the research papers that relate to this topic are going to be provided by Google. And these are the words, right? So the words are visualized as the nodes in the graph. Co-occurrences are the connections. If the words co-occur together in the same context, they will be closer to each other. Like for instance, antibiotic resistance. They appear quite often in the context of combat strategies in science. That's quite interesting, actually. So it's also talking about epidemiology much more than about warfare. And this lets me see what are the patterns of co-occurrence of those terms in the general scientific discourse. Now, one thing here that I want to point out is that the word strategy is quite big because we searched for combat strategies. Those words were removed because if they were not, they would actually take a lot of attention. So let me show you what would happen if the words were actually inside the graph itself. You see they would appear and be quite big in the graph. So what we want to do is we want to actually remove them, and this is what InfraNodus does automatically. You choose combat strategy, hide it from the graph, and then you see what else exists out there on this topic. So the context around the search query. You can see here the main topics are antimicrobial resistance, system improvement, therapeutic review, infection progress. So now I can go to the analytics panel, go to the blind spots, that's where the gaps are detected, click highlight a network, and I can reiterate through the gaps in the graph to see if there is any interesting gaps that I could explore further and where I could generate interesting questions. So I could even go for the gap between antimicrobial resistance and system improvement. And here again, instead of having the AI provide me a ready-made answer on what this topic is about, instead I choose to have it generate a question for me. So I'm going to select this gap and then I'm going to say generate a question for me. And now it's saying how can integrating psychological interventions aimed at reducing paranoia and panic during pandemic improve strategies to combat antimicrobial and antifungal resistance in healthcare systems globally. So that's a very interesting question because it's talking about some sort of PsyOps, but in relation to mass panic. Very interesting question. I'm actually going to save it to notes. That's what I usually do if I find interesting questions. And then I can click elaborate and send it back to the AI with an instruction. So I'm going to say elaborate on this statement, and I'm going to have it generate an answer for me so I can get myself started thinking in this direction. Or I can also think of this question myself, right? So here the big difference is that I'm not just looking at all the different topics that exist on the subject and trying to understand what they're talking about. I'm already actively engaging into developing this discourse further by focusing on the gaps, generating questions, and thinking of possible answers. So that's why AI is thinking with me here and not for me. That I find very interesting. Here it says, integrating psychological interventions can enhance resilience and compliance in populations. So that's interesting because I don't like the word compliance in this context. I think it's a bit manipulative. That's interesting to take notice of, which is crucial for the effective implementation of health guidelines. So there I could also think that in fact those strategies could be used to also control people as well. This approach can lead to more mindful use of antibiotics and antifungals, reducing misuse and overuse that fuels resistance. Additionally, reduced panic and paranoia may facilitate smoother healthcare operations, allowing for focused efforts on antimicrobial stewardship programs and research into novel therapeutics. So that's interesting. I can take this idea and start thinking about how those strategies of misinformation and propaganda, also maybe of some kind of mind control, can be used to drive population to be calm, but to also use them to kind of like control people as well, right? So there is like a double-edged sword here that you want to prevent mass panic, but also what do you do if you want people to stay free and to be able to express themselves and so on. It's kind of like a fine line here, and that could be an interesting topic of further research for me. And again, you see, I'm not just trying to make the AI give me the ultimate answer. I'm just using it to stimulate my thinking process, and that I find is a super interesting approach. And this is why inside InfraNodus, this idea that you can use the AI to generate a question is always promoted first. Like, it's not about the summary, it's not about the main topics identified, it's about generating questions. And because it's the questions that will help you think about a certain topic. Sometimes people ask, what's the practical use of it? I mean, I think that's a really amazing practical use because you are stimulating your mind. Like if you play a computer game, for instance, it's entertainment, right? Like you're maybe resting, getting distracted, but here you're actually actively stimulating yourself to think into the direction of bridging the gaps in existing discourses. And this discourse can be something that exists already or something that you wrote yourself, so that's super useful. Let me show you one last thing. It's the Obsidian plugin that's made also using InfraNodus, and here I have a text on CQB, close quarter combat, just some ideas from a video I watched. Again, InfraNodus provides me a summary here of the main topic, so that's already quite useful. But the most useful thing here is if I click on the gaps, I identify the gaps. So for example, threat, engagement, and medical defense. You see those two clusters are on the opposite sides of the graph. That's interesting because it means they're not connected in this particular text. Then if I click on the question, it's going to generate a question for me that links those two. So for instance here, how can drones equipped with multi-tools and medical kits enhance threat neutralization and protection during irregular attack scenarios while facilitating efficient engagement and response to emergencies? So that's great because it's like almost like a product idea here. Don't think of just CQB, the AI is telling me. It's telling me, think about how drones could be used not only in warfare, but also to help people to maybe prevent explosions and stuff like that, right? So that's a very interesting thought. I'm gonna save the clip here because I find it's very interesting. I'm gonna keep it for later. And I think, yeah, it's a great idea that I can explore further. For instance, by drafting a product idea or maybe researching if there are actually drones used in that way. And as you see, it's a much better way of engaging with this material than just trying to memorize what you've learned, right? I'm not just memorizing what I've learned, but I'm starting to ask questions, and this is how I develop the ideas further. So I hope you find that interesting. If you're also curious to try it out, you can do this on infranodus.com. We also have a browser extension and an Obsidian plugin, so if you have an account on InfraNodus, you can use those two. Just install them into your Chrome or any Chrome-compatible browser. Firefox works as well. Or get the Obsidian plugin in the community plugins. And yes, let me know what you think about it. If you also like using the same sort of approach and what you think about it, please leave a comment below and I'll be happy to answer. Thank you.